Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we are diving into a topic that is already making waves globally. President Trump's announcement of some pretty big new tariffs. He called it Liberation Day. So we've been going through tons of news reports and expert analysis to break it all down for you.
Yeah, and it's not just a tweak here and there. This is a complete overhaul of how America approaches trade. So what we want to do in this deep dive is kind of dissect these tariffs for you, like what they really mean, what could happen to the global economy, and most importantly, for you guys listening, how could this actually affect your own wallets?
Okay, so let's kick things off with this Liberation Day thing, right? Yeah. April 2nd, 2025. That's when President Trump dropped this bombshell. And his choice of words was very deliberate. He's talking about ending decades of trade injustice. And it's like a pivotal moment for America's economic destiny. I mean, It's pretty intense stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And the big idea behind all this, the way he's selling it, is this concept of reciprocal tariffs. Basically, the U.S. is going to slap tariffs on imports from other countries, but those tariffs will be exactly the same as what those countries put on American exports.
So basically giving them a taste of their own medicine trade-wise. He even went as far as saying that American taxpayers have been ripped off for like the past 50 years because of the way trade has been working.
Yeah.
And the promises that come with this are huge. Bringing manufacturing jobs back, revitalizing American industries. I mean, he's making this sound like it's not just about economics, it's about national security.
Exactly. And he made that connection very clearly. Trade imbalances, according to him, weaken America's strength and independence, and this national security angle is important because it could give the executive branch more power to enforce these tariffs without having to go through Congress.
Which, as we saw in our sources, is already causing some friction in Washington. Okay, so let's get into the details. What are these tariffs actually all about? It sounds like they're pretty wide-ranging.
Oh yeah, starting April 5th, there's going to be this baseline 10% tariff on almost everything coming into the U.S. That's just the starting point, though. Things get even more interesting with higher tariffs for specific countries kicking in on April 9th.
And didn't they make a really quick move on the auto industry?
Yeah, that was fast. They put a 20% tariff on all imported cars, and that happened right away on Thursday, April 3rd. I mean, that's a big deal and could really change things for anyone who wants to buy a car.
And then there's this whole thing about the Dirty 15. These are the countries he's accusing of taking advantage of the U.S. Do we know exactly who's on that list?
Well, the reports we looked at didn't list all of the Dirty 15 countries, but we do have the reciprocal tariff rates that were announced for a whole bunch of countries as of April 2nd.
All right, let's get into the numbers because that really shows us just how big this is.
Totally. So China, they're hit with a 34% reciprocal tariff. And when you add that to the tariffs that were already in place, the total tariff rate on Chinese goods coming into the U.S. is a whopping 54%, confirmed by the Treasury Secretary. The EU's got a 20% tariff, Japan 24%, South Korea 25%.
Those are some serious increases. What about some of the other big players in global trade?
Switzerland, they're at 31%, the UK 10%, Taiwan at 32%, Malaysia also at 24%, India's facing a 26% reciprocal tariff, and one article actually kind of at a discounted rate, Brazil and Singapore both have a 10% tariff.
Wow, the list just keeps going, huh?
Yep, Indonesia and Taiwan both at 32%, and Vietnam's got a really high one at 46%. Oh, and one source even mentioned a 49% rate for Cambodia, which seems to be the highest one out there. Ukraine has a 10% tariff, and Venezuela's at 15%.
A pretty long list impacting all sorts of economies. Now, were there any countries that got a pass on these new tariffs?
Yeah, Canada and Mexico, they got exemptions on these additional tariffs, mainly because of the USMCA trade agreement we've got with them. And this is important, even with the USMCA, any goods coming from Canada or Mexico that don't follow the USMCA rules, they'll still have to pay a 25% tariff. Plus, energy and potash from those countries will be taxed at 10% no matter what.
So even with the USMCA, there are still some tariff issues with our neighbors. And this is where it gets kind of weird. I remember reading something about tariffs on uninhabited islands.
Yeah, that was a crazy detail. They're putting tariffs even on remote places like Heard and McDonald Islands. Those are Australian territories in the middle of nowhere, way down in the Indian Ocean, with no one living there permanently. Even they're facing a 10% tariff on anything they export, which is strange because they basically have no economy to speak of.
Yeah.
Several other remote territories are in the same boat with that 10% levy.
I guess it really shows how serious they are about this. And there was another announcement, too, about tariffs on beer and aluminum cans, right?
Yeah, totally separate from these reciprocal tariffs. They decided to put a 25% tariff on beer and empty aluminum cans. It looks like this is connected to some changes they made to existing tariffs on aluminum imports.
So they're using a bunch of different strategies hitting different industries and countries in different ways. So what's the White House saying about all this? What's the reasoning behind this whole web of tariffs?
Well, the main thing they're saying is it's to fix trade imbalances. They're trying to make things fair, not just by looking at the tariffs other countries put on American goods, but also by taking into account what they're calling non-monetary trade barriers. We're talking about things like different regulations for businesses, environmental rules, consumption taxes, and even accusations of countries messing with their currency.
So they want to level the playing field in a way that goes beyond just the direct tariffs on goods.
Exactly. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, they apparently used a specific formula to calculate these reciprocal tariff rates, and the goal is to make up for the disadvantages American businesses are facing. And President Trump has said it over and over. He thinks the U.S. has basically been giving other countries free money because of these trade deficits.
That's a pretty bold statement. So let's talk about the potential fallout from this, because that's where a lot of the debate and worry is. What are some of the economic predictions we're seeing in our sources?
Well, Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor, he initially said that these tariffs would bring in like $600 billion a year in revenue. He even threw out the number $6 trillion over the next 10 years. He's calling this a big tax cut for American workers.
But most economists don't seem to agree with that, do they?
No, not really. Most of them see these tariffs as a tax increase. But it's not the government getting more money. It's American consumers and businesses who will end up paying more for things. Goldman Sachs, for example, they have raised their prediction of a U.S. recession happening in the next year to 35%, and they've lowered their forecast for U.S. GDP growth in 2025.
That's a bit worrying. What else are economists concerned about?
JP Morgan analysts think these tariffs could push inflation up by 1 to 1.5% this year. They're looking at a measure called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, which basically tracks how much stuff costs in the U.S. It's a big deal when it comes to measuring inflation. And they're saying this could push the U.S. economy really close to a recession. People are worried about consumers losing buying power and spending less overall.
So everyday people could feel this in their wallets. What about specific sectors of the economy?
Oh, the auto industry. They're predicting total chaos and price hikes, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 per car. Redfin's economists think fewer new homes will be built because the tariffs make building materials more expensive. And the National Foreign Trade Council, they're saying everything will cost more from groceries to car insurance.
So it sounds like these tariffs could have a really wide impact.
Absolutely. Fitch Ratings even said that these tariffs could cause a global recession. They pointed out that the overall U.S. tariff rate on everything coming into the country has gone way up to levels we haven't seen since around 1910. And the Business Roundtable, which represents a lot of big American companies, they're also worried about these tariffs hurting U.S. manufacturers, workers, families, and companies that export goods.
And we were already seeing some signs of trouble even before these tariffs really kicked in, right?
Yeah, U.S. manufacturing actually shrunk in March. The ISM Manufacturing Index dropped below 50, which means things are slowing down. They think some of that is because businesses were nervous about these tariffs, and analysts are predicting that India's exports in various sectors will be hit pretty hard because of the different tariff rates.
So the economic forecasts aren't looking too good. They're talking about price increases, slower growth, and a higher chance of recession. Let's shift gears and look at how the financial markets reacted to this Liberation Day announcement.
Oh, the markets definitely did not like it. As soon as President Trump made the announcement, U.S. stock futures took a nosedive. We saw big drops in futures for the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ.
That's a pretty clear sign that investors are worried. What about stock markets in other parts of the world?
Asian markets didn't look good either. Hong Kong stocks fell more than 2%. There were big drops in Shanghai Tokyo's Nikkei index, South Korea's Kospi, and Australia's ASX too. And ETFs, those are exchange-traded funds that track specific countries and regions like India, China, and Europe, they all lost value too.
So it's not just a U.S. problem. The whole world is worried. And now it seems like this is even changing predictions about future interest rates.
Yep, Wall Street traders are now less likely to think that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates in June. It looks like they're concerned about inflation because of these tariffs.
So there's a lot of economic and financial uncertainty right now. Let's talk about the political and international reactions. Here in the U.S., it doesn't seem like everyone is happy about this, even within the president's own party.
Yeah, you're right. The Senate actually passed a resolution trying to block President Trump's tariffs on Canada. The vote was 51 to 48, and 4 Republican senators voted against the president, along with the Democrats. That shows you there's definitely some division and concern in the Senate about this whole thing.
What have the Democratic leaders been saying about it?
Oh, they're not holding back at all. Senator Schumer and Representative Jeffries have been really critical. They're calling these tariffs a recipe for a chaotic trade war. They even came up with a new term, recession day. They're basically saying this will make things more expensive for American families, and there's no way around it.
But it seems like some Republicans are at least saying they support this, right? Even if they have some doubts.
Yeah, a few Republican senators have said they're worried about what might happen to the economy in the short term, but overall, they seem to be okay with the idea of getting fairer trade deals. It's like they're taking a wait-and-see approach, hoping things will work out in the long run, even if there are some bumps in the road.
All right, let's see what's happening on the world stage.
Yeah.
How have other countries reacted to these tariffs?
It's been a mixed bag. Some are really worried and talking about retaliation, while others are trying to stay calm and keep talking. The German auto industry, they came out swinging. They said these tariffs will only create losers, and they want the EU to hit back hard.
That's a pretty strong reaction.
Yeah.
What about the EU as a whole? What's their official stance?
Leaders like Chancellor Scholz of Germany and European Commission President von der Leyen, they've said the EU will respond clearly and decisively. They're putting together a strong plan just in case they need to retaliate. But they're also open to talking with the U.S.
What about Canada and Mexico, our closest trading partners?
Canadian officials, including Finance Minister Bachrock, they've promised to protect Canadian workers, and they've basically said they might use tariffs too. Mexico's President Sheinbaum is also thinking about taking action, but she's also willing to negotiate with the U.S.
And what about some of the other countries facing big tariff hikes like Japan and the UK?
Japan's been pretty vocal about this. People like Foreign Minister Hayashi and former Minister Ishiba, they've been urging the U.S. to rethink these tariffs. The UK, on the other hand, they're being more cautious. Shadow Chancellor Reeves has said they're focused on getting a trade deal done with the U.S. after Brexit, and they don't want to rock the boat by retaliating right away.
And there were some other reactions from world leaders that were kind of cryptic, weren't there?
Yeah, Poland's Prime Minister Tusk, he put out this weird message online about really and truly reciprocal tariffs, and he said they need to make adequate decisions. It's not totally clear what he meant by that, and Italy's Prime Minister Meloni, even though she generally gets along with President Trump, she said publicly that the tariffs are wrong and they won't help the U.S. She wants to avoid a big trade war.
So the international scene is pretty tense and unpredictable. And back here in the U.S., it's not just the politicians who have strong opinions about this.
You're telling me former Vice President Pence, he called these tariffs the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history. And there's a group called Rethink Trade that's already pushing the government to stop companies from using these tariffs as an excuse to jack up prices.
So there's a worry that businesses might use this as a chance to make things more expensive than they need to be. Now, what about different industries in the U.S.? Are they all on the same page about these tariffs?
Not at all. The United Auto Workers Union, the UAW, they're actually happy about the tariffs on cars. They think it could help bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. But groups representing the steel and aluminum industries, they're not so thrilled about the tariffs on Canada. They say they rely on Canadian imports for their own production. And then you've got the shrimpers in the Gulf Coast, who are all for tariffs on imported shrimp. They want to protect their own market share.
So it's a mixed bag with different industries taking different sides. What about the industries that rely on global supply chains?
They're facing a lot of uncertainty. They're worried about disruptions and higher costs because of the tariffs. Some tequila producers have said they might just absorb the extra costs instead of making their customers pay more. But there's also talk about drug prices going up in the U.S. because of tariffs on imported pharmaceuticals, and that could affect everyone's healthcare costs. Overall, businesses across the board are trying to figure out what this all means for their bottom line and how they do business. There was even a report about Volkswagen of America. They stopped shipping cars from Mexico for a bit, and they put a note on their vehicles about a new import fee. They reacted pretty quickly to the tariffs.
Yeah, that Volkswagen example really shows how real this is.
Yeah.
And there's still the big question of what other countries might do. Will they retaliate?
That's a huge concern. We know that the EU and China have retaliated with tariffs before when the U.S. put tariffs on their goods. And now we're hearing the EU, Canada, and Mexico say they might do the same thing. But Treasury Secretary Bessent, he's basically told other countries not to retaliate. He's saying that could make things even worse and lead to an even bigger trade war.
That's a risky move. It could easily escalate into a global trade war. Okay, so let's go over President Trump's main reasons for making these big trade changes. What's he saying about all this?
His main points are all about protecting American farmers and ranchers. He specifically mentioned tariffs on Canadian dairy as an example of unfair trade. He's calling this a declaration of economic independence for the U.S., saying it's needed to stand up for American workers who he thinks have been taken advantage of in global trade. He also wants to boost U.S. manufacturing and shrink the trade deficit. Although it's worth mentioning that the U.S. actually has a surplus in services. And finally, he's declared a national economic emergency. He's saying the trade deficits are a security risk, which is why he needs these special powers to act.
Right. So a whole bunch of arguments covering different parts of the U.S. economy and national interests.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's pretty clear that these new tariffs are a big deal. They're changing the whole landscape of global trade. We've talked about the possibility of some serious economic consequences, with a lot of economists worried about rising prices and the risk of a recession. We've also looked at how the rest of the world is reacting from anger to caution. And then there's the whole question of whether other countries will fight back, which could really shake things up. It's a pretty uncertain time for global trade.
Yeah, it is. So for everyone listening, think about this. How could these tariffs, this declaration of economic independence, affect you personally? From the prices you pay at the store to the stability of the whole economy, what changes might you and businesses have to make in the long run? I'd say dig into the specific tariff rates that apply to the things you're interested in, and keep an eye on how this whole thing unfolds. This is a big deal with the potential to change things for a long time to come.